Welcome back to After Order, a series from Macrodose and the Alameda Institute exploring power, sovereignty, and crisis in today's unstable world. In this week's show, I'm joined by Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla, political strategist, activist, co-general coordinator of the Progressive International and executive secretary of the Hague Group, a coalition of global South nations launched in 2025 to hold Israel accountable for its crimes in Palestine. Varsha's work sits at the intersection of law, empire, and resistance, as both an organiser and an intellectual, grappling with questions of sovereignty and what it might mean to build an internationalism rooted in the global south. From Honduras, where a US corporation is suing the state for billions in a secret tribunal, to Ecuador, where an authoritarian regime with the direct assistance of the US is crushing democracy in the name of the war on drugs, to the bombs falling on Gaza, where international law appears to be both invoked and ignored in real time. It's clear we are living through a rupture in the global order. But Varsha argues that order, the so-called rules-based international system governed by the multilateral institutions, was always and fundamentally a veneer for the systems of coercion, extraction, and exploitation that uphold global capitalism. In the context of war in Iran, it's a particularly prescient argument. The veil has lifted. We are seeing the return of hard power across the world and an open defiance of international institutions from Cuba to Palestine. But we're also seeing something else. A wave of solidarity with the victims of colonial oppression and new forms of coordination among states seeking to resist through the cracks of disorder. So the question at the heart of today's conversation is this. As the old fiction of order breaks down, what comes next? And what would it mean to build a different kind of sovereignty and a different kind of internationalism in a world after order? Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla, welcome to After Order.
Thank you for having me, James.
Start with the first question, probably the obvious place to start, which is the US-Israel war in Iran, which, aside from its sort of profound consequences in the Gulf, across the Middle East itself, for the wider world economy, there's also this deep shock that it seems to have caused to the idea of international law or even international legitimacy. There's just total contempt for both Israel and the US are displaying at this point in time. You write in your essay for Alameda and for After Order, you say that the collapse of empire's legal fiction makes it more vulnerable or more dangerous. I'm wondering if you can sort of spell out what you mean by that in saying that first, that there was a legal fiction, and second, where its collapse leaves us.
Yeah, the absence of this legal fiction, I think, is very clear in the US-Israeli attack on Iran, as we've seen, starting from the bare minimum, which is, if you remember the war in Iraq, at least the United States government spent about 5-6 months trying to manufacture the lie of weapons of mass destruction before there was even a single boot on the ground. And this time, none of that, right? It's just very clear, these are our enemy, no explanation, we're just going to go and destroy the entire population through collective punishment. But I actually wanted to start somewhere else, which is, I think, a general understanding for most people when you look at violence against oppressed people of the world, formerly colonized people of the world, countries of the global south. The idea is, however bad things are, surely they're not as bad as eras of colonialism past, right? That some things changed, and in the new post-colonial order, we have a semblance of international law and we have a semblance of rules-based international order. I had the experience this month of receiving a notice of withdrawal from the Honduran embassy while I was in The Hague, from the Hague Group, which is a coalition of countries defending international law. Honduras was a founding member, and after a change in government, they've now decided we're going to withdraw. We no longer need to hold Israel accountable for its violations, and in fact, think that we should not stand alongside these other countries. But what happened in Honduras now, in this current moment, is not at all different from what happened in history. We all know of the story of Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala, and I think it's quite important to look at what happened in that point in time. I mean, it's nearly what now, 100 years ago, that you had the United Fruit Company, which is now called Chiquita Foods, but the United Fruit Company showed up on the shores across Latin America and the Caribbean, Panama, Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, essentially looking to grow bananas, but then coming to control every single element of these countries, from railways to electricity to telephone lines, winning land concessions and becoming de facto rulers of the country, reducing the owners of this land, the poor fishermen, the garifuna, the mestizo, into plantation workers in these places. And of course, you had resistance. You had the people say, these are our lands, we refuse to be plantation workers. And that's when the United Fruit Company would reveal itself to be the United States government. lo and behold, you have 1952, Jacob Arbenz, a left-wing government, does agrarian reform, stands with the side of the resisting people and says, we are going to take our land back. And that's when the true force of the United States government through the CIA come in and overthrow the government through a coup. That exact story repeats itself in Honduras today, leading to me receiving this withdrawal notice from the group that I run, which is essentially Peter Thiel in the new United Fruits Company era, or mask, as you might call it, trying to build a libertarian paradise in Honduras. No rules, no governance whatsoever, but a paradise without any restrictions for the rich. And it'll sound a bit, James, like I'm making this up, but really they wanted to build an island with where Bitcoin was the official currency, where voting was based on, was proportional to the amount of property that you owned. I mean, this is a charter that these guys wrote up, right? Through Prospera Inc., crypto billionaire, startup run from California. Once again, you have the people of Honduras saying, no, this is our land, please back off. But it's enforced through law, again, with a United States military coup that overthrows Mel Zelaya. And the next government that comes in creates a special economic zone that gives these guys complete free abandon to do whatever they want. Once again, you have the people resisting and saying, we're going to get rid of this, and this time we're going to do it electorally. So here comes a new socialist president, just like Arbenz, now, Xiomara Castro, who through the full, by the way, a complete unanimous vote in the parliament overthrows the special economic zones. The punishment is, unlike a coup then, is now through Washington's secret tribunal, through investor-state dispute settlement clauses that exist in, bilateral investment treaties that all developing countries have, suing the government for $10.2 billion, which, by the way, I mean, if you know anything about Honduras, is nearly 2/3 of its GDP, almost all of its annual national budget. So, of course, Honduras can't do this, cannot compete with a secret Washington tribunal, says, I'm going to exit this treaty. Once it decides to exit this treaty, then again you go back to the same old real brute force logic under Donald Trump, where he says, we don't want this president anymore. I'm going to openly endorse, illegally, brazenly, another candidate, holding the elections hostage for 2 months. And now that other candidate has won, Tito Asfura, who is Trump's favored presidential candidate for this, who's brought back the investor-state dispute settlement, withdrawn from the Hague Group. I mean, I've given you this long-winded story to really say what's really changed. I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that the horrors of colonialism and the violence of colonialism has existed through these now new instruments of ISDS clauses and bilateral investment treaties, of Washington secret tribunals, and through electoral observer missions led from the United States that are used precisely to plant their candidates into power. And I think that's even more dangerous than before, because that's the disguise, that's the fiction that we're talking about.
I mean, picking up on that, or part of that, is this point about the economic vulnerabilities of the system and the economic relationships that you talk about there, exploitative as they so very often are. We've seen some of these vulnerabilities just in the last, it's now 4 weeks, with the response of Iran to the attack by the US and Israel, including particularly closing the Straits of Hormuz and using that as a critical point of leverage against the rest of the entire world, but primarily against the US and Israel as a way of sort of forcing its position of relative weakness militarily into something that looks far more sort of impregnable in practice to the attack that is being mounted there. So I suppose the question is, what would countries, perhaps particularly in the global south, need to think about in terms of what are their strategic priorities? What are their points of potential leverage in a world where this rules-based order, so-called, is collapsing about our ears?
I'd say the strategic priorities are twofold. One, for the countries of the global south to decouple from the West, primarily to decouple from the United States, and to unite with the countries of the global south. So diversification on the one hand, and collective action on the other, with those that share their priorities to break this kind of system of, subordination or dependency logic that they're stuck in. James, you've done multiple conversations with political economists who would have, laid out this, the way in which the dependency logic keeps developing countries in a subordinate position through the IMF, through World Bank, through austerity measures. But I wanted to talk about, what particular instance that really shook me, which is I spent about 2.5 years working on COVID-19 vaccines. Just not a political issue, you might think. And really, this was a moment where supposedly the entire world was united against the virus, right? We were all suddenly on the same side of this war against the pandemic. But 6, 7, 9, 12 months into the discovery of COVID-19 vaccines, you saw twice, thrice, 3 times the amount of doses that each citizen would need being hoarded in countries of the North, in the West, and 50 to 60% of population in more across the developing world still not having access to even a single dose of the vaccine. Why did we have that? Did countries of the global South not try to produce their own? Did we not have factories? We absolutely did. We know that we had up to 150 factories that were sitting idle across Asia and Africa that could have produced the Moderna vaccine. They weren't allowed to because the patents were kept secret. We know for a fact that we try to make bilateral deals with, Bolivia, for example, with Johnson & Johnson, said, could you issue us a license just for this one vaccine for us to produce it only for our own people? We won't sell it anywhere else. And that was denied. We tried to go to the World Trade Organization, led by South Africa and India at the time, and then supported by 122, I think, and eventually became much larger countries for a temporary patent waiver. Again, not really even shaking the system. These aren't radical moves, right? Not shaking the private system, just saying temporarily for a few months, could all of us produce vaccines for our own people? Again, not disturbing the market share, not becoming a competitor, but purely to produce vaccines. And this was opposed by every single European government and the United States government. And this is not accidental. If you look at who the European Commission met in the first few months of the pandemic, for the first year, I think they had it's reported as something akin to 123 meetings with pharma executives and not a single meeting with anybody else. MSF, Doctors Without Borders, was denied a meeting for 8.5 months, even as they met pharma executives across the world. I'm mentioning this to say we were blockaded at every level and the power handed off to Bill Gates, essentially, and being told everything must be routed through COVAX, a completely private body run by a private billionaire into whose hands, the lives of 4.5 billion people were placed and who received expired doses. The UK sent expired doses to Africa, to Uganda. We know that AstraZeneca, which was produced with public money and in fact wanted to make it a public good, Bill Gates convinced the Oxford scientists who produced it to keep it private instead of public, and then sold it akin to $6 a dose to Uganda as opposed to $2 in the United Kingdom. I mean, it's just incredible, right? This should have been a scandal of such huge proportions that you have an unaccountable private body that is given control in the middle of a humanitarian catastrophe that then lies to the public but goes completely scot-free. And at the time, we thought surely the Global South has some options beyond arms outstretched, waiting either for donations from global North governments or waiting for pharma executives to change their conscience, right? And so we began to work with governments of Cuba, Venezuela, government of Mexico, Argentina, before Javier Milei, smaller governments, Kisumu County in Kenya, the Kerala government in India, to simply say, could we produce our own vaccines with our own sovereignty? Cuba offered its technology patent-free. Countries like Mexico and Argentina offered their production facilities, and countries like Bolivia said, we don't have either, but we'll put money for this health internationalism bloc. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. That kind of collective action experiments that can finally begin to kind of break this, the paralysis of, the so-called rules-based order that crushes us.
I mean, picking up on that, one of the countries you mentioned, Cuba, which is currently subjected to a blockade launched by the US for oil products going into the island, condemned by UN experts as an unparalleled act of economic coercion, causing real and genuine hardship across the island there. But also, I think, and this is interesting, at least to see it happening, also a spark for a display of international solidarity, a kind of dramatic upsurge of international solidarity for Cuba and the people of Cuba in particular against what the US is trying to impose here, and using the rules as it would define with the old rules-based order, and using the most extreme forms of economic coercion, but the potential there to break through it. I mean, where does that kind of solidarity movement get us, do you think?
Cuba's it's a tragedy. I think it's isolated like never before by every single government and state in the region and across the world. It's only the people that have answered their historic call and their historic responsibility. My team is just returning along with 600 other comrades from 33 countries around the world on the Nuestra America convoy to Cuba. That saw tremendous amounts of solidarity. Ordinary people. We've had a woman just writing to us saying, my husband and I are packing 5 suitcases full of medicines, jumping onto a boat, and we're going to Cuba. We've had doctors showing up from Italy in a flight full of 100 of them with medical supplies. We've had retirees from the United States who, by the way, are now being detained at the Miami airport on their way back by Homeland Security simply for their act of solidarity. But the Cuba blockade, really, to understand it in today's context, you have to look back and see what are the instruments that have been used against it. And truly, I think the scope of it is staggering and unprecedented and unparalleled anywhere in the world. Usually, when people talk about the US embargo against Cuba, the first level at which everyone understands it is the obvious one, right? US Americans can't buy Cuban cigars.
Yeah.
Cubans can't buy American cars. Sure. But the second level of it is that what you asked earlier about the idea of the entire system working through the US dollar, through the SWIFT transaction system, which means nobody touches Cuba. So even if there is a European bank that has nothing to do with the United States that gives a loan to Cubans, they're immediately sued in US courts. In fact, BNP Paribas had to pay a $9 million fine for one single transaction. I had the experience of being in the United States and having a cocktail with my friend at a university bar, talking about Cuba, and they paid me back $5 for, again, the beer that I bought them, saying it was so fun to chat about Cuba on Venmo or US payment platform. And instantly that transaction was blocked for the word Cuba. And I was sent a list of 15 questions. This is not even under Trump, by the way. This is before, and I think the Obama years. 15 questions about explain your transaction, the use of the word Cuba. This has now been blocked. Your account is now under supervision. You will not be able to do anything unless you explain this. It's completely incredible. So the overcompliance is technically not part of the legal architecture. And this is what the United States will tell you every time you ask them. They'll say, this is about, we've decided we don't want to be friends with Cuba. We're not doing anything else. But when the United States decides it does not want to be friends with a country, the entire world then isolates it as if it's a viral contagion. But on top of that, think about the other excuse that they use, which is exactly what they're using now, that in fact, humanitarian aid, healthcare, food are exemptions under US sanctions, that of course you can buy whatever you want with this. This is impossible to do. If Cuba has to buy healthcare products, food products from the United States, it has to pay upfront in cash. For a country that is allowed zero credit from the international financial system, this is impossible to do. It also cannot buy any products that are made in the United States. So if a tractor fails to buy a replacement part, it has to first find a company that's willing to do the sanctions workaround at inflated prices, that doesn't have a single nut or bolt made in the United States, because if it does so, then it's ineligible to be sold in Cuba. If any product anywhere in the world uses a teaspoon of Cuban sugar, that product becomes ineligible to be sold in the US market. So nobody wants to buy this 1 teaspoon of sugar to put in their own markets anywhere in the world, right? So the over-compliance is really, really incredible. And we've spent years trying to document this as the extraterritorialization of US policy. But now, going back to your first question of mask of empire, so to speak, or the collapse of the legal fiction, Donald Trump is doing this for us. He's announced an oil blockade, declaring that not a single drop of oil must get to Cuba, first blocking the Venezuelan exports, and now openly declaring tariffs on third-party countries that could sell oil or send oil in any way to Cuba. This has not happened before. Just to give you an example, in the missile crisis under Kennedy, when there was an actual naval blockade, the highest peak of, nuclear tension, right, between the two countries, Kennedy still allowed oil to get to Cuba. The blockade did not stop electricity or fuel or food or any of these supplies. He's followed up tariffs with open interception. 2 Russian tankers that were headed towards Cuba with oil tankers. We know now that the US was in the waters. There was a US ship in the waters ready to intercept them, and both of them have turned away, one towards Trinidad and another towards Bahamas, effectively continuing this complete siege and blockade of the island, which amounts to collective punishment and starvation.
On that, I suppose the question that leaps out is, how far can the US continue to act like this? Because the method of economic coercion, the US leveraging its financial power and the fact that it sits at the center of global financial structures. The dollar is still it's the world currency, right? It dominates international trade. It dominates financial flows around the world. It is US institutions that oversee much of that in one form or another. And that is used increasingly as a kind of leverage against countries that have fallen foul, for whatever reason it would be, of US policy at various points. I mean, most sort of dramatically in recent years, other than what's now happening to Cuba, is of course Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. The exclusion of Russian financial institutions, up to and including the central bank, from international transactions, from the SWIFT banking system or the messaging system for the banks, and seemingly fairly effectively, at least as far as Europe and the US are concerned. But also Russia has been quite active in building alternative systems, and you start to see alternative systems in various bits of the global south being assembled. China is putting together its own sort of interbank messaging system for transactions that is not part of the SWIFT system that's so easily controlled by the Americans. So you wonder how far this economic coercion will continue to operate as a policy, that at some point it becomes unworkable when you have large chunks of the world are starting to drop out of it or starting to suspect that it will get used against them in some form at some point in the future.
I think we're certainly seeing the beginning of that. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I do think it's extremely significant what we're seeing in the Strait of Hormuz right now with Iran, and the offer that they've made that they will give safe passage to any country that buys oil, not in the US dollar, but in the Chinese yuan or the renminbi, is incredible. Right? This is precisely the decoupling and the diversification that we've been talking about, that multiple countries in the global south have been trying to do. Set up currency swap lines, again, Cuba with India, Cuba with China, precisely to circumvent the US dollar, which have all received all forms of attack. We're now seeing that happen. Countries are lining up, and I'm sure we'll see more of it in the coming weeks, in order to pay for oil because of the way that the choke point has been leveraged by Iran. The other thing that is relevant is a kind of more almost a psychological analysis of the situation, right? The US has been able to maintain its control, I think, of course, through economic coercion, but there was always a carrot along with a stick. But it's now just stick, stick, stick. And even more importantly, I think the second element, which is it's an unreliable stick. So even if I'm a country that decides to take the lashing because it means I'm going to be on its side, that's not the case. I may get the lashing anyway, and then Trump decides I'm going to drop them a couple of months down the line. India, my own country, is a very good example of this. We've really towed the line with the United States for quite some time, only to be broken up with quite brutally because Pakistan decided to make a better offer. And that was just acknowledging Trump's role in the India-Pakistan war and saying, yes, he should get the Nobel Peace Prize, which the Indian government decided not to do and found itself suddenly facing tariffs, despite, again, I have to say, 12 years of Prime Minister Modi completely towing the line with the United States government, and especially with Donald Trump.
I mean, it's sort of pathetic, although you have to admire whoever it was in the Pakistan government that happened on this genius, very cheap, simple move to get around Donald Trump. But it's sort of, there's something deeply dysfunctional about a world system that wobbles backwards and forwards on the behavior of one person in the White House in this way, which to me feels like not so much a problem as a sort of liberal thing like Trump's just crazy or whatever. It's like, yeah, that may or may not be true. The deeper thing is that we have a system in which this is happening, that it depends on what is happening in the White House on a sort of minute-by-minute basis to unsettle what happens in the rest of the world. And you'd feel, and you can see it happening, that this is something that breaks apart the old forms of globalization, that exactly as you say, it's just not reliable. It ties in with the problem of economic coercion that America has insisted on using, and not just, of course, on Donald Trump. This was Joe Biden. This was Barack Obama. This is all the way back to Clinton, at least, with forms of coercion and sanctions being applied, that the US starts to look like an unreliable custodian of a global system. So you want to set up something else. You try and create alternative structures.
There's something else that's, I think, unique about this moment. Of course, it looks like an unreliable custodian, but is it even the United States government that's an unreliable custodian? It's privatization, I think, to an extent that we've never seen before. So if you look at the privatization of the deep state and of the war infrastructure, that's always been the case, right? I mean, we saw it with Blackwater and the mercenary death squads, even the drone campaigns of the Obama years, that of course already began to enter the infrastructure. But now we're seeing not just privatization of the military, but privatization of the entire state. Who's Steve Witkoff? Who's Jared Kushner? I mean, these are people who are making money off of the deals that, Steve Witkoff's son is meant to make billions of dollars on the deals that his father's negotiating. Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump, is just sent everywhere, apparently, as the envoy of the United States. So we're seeing now, I think, a privatization of the state, of its diplomacy arm, of every single infrastructure, really, and even more so of the privatization of the United Nations. I mean, the Board of Peace, sending Melania Trump to chair the UN Security Council meeting. So there's a profit loss logic that's bleeding in everywhere. And we know for a fact, again, in conversations with many of our diplomats, that as they think about negotiating with the United States, they're not just thinking negotiating with empire, but really a businessman. Like, what can we offer? The straightest example is, of course, the Qataris giving the United States, Donald Trump, a plane. But in every other negotiation as well, I think this logic has really entered the ecosystem, which is really incredibly dangerous. And I think we're only seeing the beginning of the consequences of that.
But is it more dangerous than what we had before in that sense? Like, you've touched on how the legal fiction of the older order, and it always disguised a certain kind of transactional element into how states related to each other. I don't want to get too sort of realist about this, but it's states do not necessarily have a reason to cooperate, right? And you have particular sets of interests of people in those states, in particular the rulers of those states, that may or may not match at various points in time. So cooperation is always a bit sort of uncertain in a world that looks like this, divided into those states. So that transactional element has always been there, wouldn't you say?
I would say that, and I think is a more dangerous, less dangerous is not the most interesting question here. But the contradictions are plain to see, right? Again, if you look at the Israel example, for instance, what does Donald Trump want? Donald Trump wants, beyond anything else, he's declared, I want to see the end of the Islamic Revolution before midterms. He's been saying this to different people. Now, whatever you may think of him, and I certainly don't think he's a grand strategy empire kind of guy. He's burned the house down for the insurance money, and ultimately extremely destructive for the US economy kind of guy. But he wants resolution of some kind and to be able to claim victory, which is directly at odds with what his closest friend, or the United States' closest friend, Benjamin Netanyahu, wants, which is not a resolution in any form, but a constant destabilization in the region in order to, in the very, very long term, achieve greater Israel and achieve Israeli dominance. So we're beginning to see those contradictions come into play, and I think that's quite interesting to watch.
I mean, the other thing to pick up on there is how far would we call this privatization? Because it's like, on one level, yes, there's a private interest, more obviously, has crept into what states do. It's very obviously transactional, how Donald Trump thinks about the world, how the US state behaves now. It's we will threaten you with this and you will offer this in return. And either it's on a fairly superficial level, like the UK decides he gets a state visit every time he gets to meet the king and this sort of thing, and go and visit his golf course in Scotland or whatever it might be. Or it can be a more fundamental, this is a negotiation over access to tariffs and technology and something more serious. It's deeply transactional, and it's a privatized, or at least a more obviously privatized form of logic that the state is following here. And it's one that also ties into, like, I personally am going to make myself rich out of doing this. I mean, this is very clearly a calculation that most of the people around Donald Trump, including Donald himself, actually have on some level are working like this. But it's also a fusion of the state with private capital at that point. Like, if I look at, and we were talking to Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff about their book, Muskism, just a week ago. And that's a good account of how Elon Musk in particular has been able to wheedle his way into the state and get money out of the state and make himself indispensable to the state. And it's privatization in one sense, because Elon Musk is a private individual who wants to get as rich as possible. That's true. But it's also, he's becoming part of the state. Like, the state suddenly finds this indispensable. So it's not like we've just chopped a bit off and sold it and private companies going to run and off you go. It's more like these things are becoming fused in a really sort of weird, for countries in the West, fairly unprecedented fashion, I think.
Yeah, because I mean, think about what's happening this week. We have a report from the New York Times that claims that the United States is holding its HIV aid funding to Zambia as a hostage negotiation, as a hostage deal, unless the Zambian government signs a deal for critical minerals, right? Because they want to compete with China, and they see the copper trade especially as being completely dominated by China and want a piece of it, which Zambia has refused to give. And so they've now halted all HIV AIDS funding. We've seen this in the case of Zimbabwe in the past, where just because they did land reform and took the land back, sanctions were imposed across the board until now their currency has been completely crippled, and that being used against against them to say, hey, if you take the sanctions off, if you pay the compensation to your own former colonizers, we will then take the sanctions, the boot of sanctions off of your neck. So yes, and again, this is not new, the idea of the fusing of the private capital, but more precisely that any kind of sovereignty experiments, any kind of attempt at getting some economic space, liberation in some form in the global south immediately threatens accumulation in the core, right? What you would call the kind of Western colonizer countries is intolerable for the West, is absolutely intolerable for the West.
I'm looking at this, or sort of turning the question around a bit. I wanted to talk about your own work with the Hague Group and the story behind it and what it's trying to achieve in the countries you're working with. You mentioned it earlier. Would you like to sort of explain a bit what's going on there?
The Hague Group, I wish actually hadn't launched, or the should not have been launched. Why do I say this as a founder of it? Is because our existing legal institutions should have sufficed. I mean, nearly a year and a half into the genocide, which is January 2025, at the point at which we launched, the United Nations had already spoken about the travesty that we were seeing in Gaza. The International Court of Justice had already announced that the genocide was possible. The International Criminal Court had issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and nothing. We saw no government and no state act in response to stop the genocide. It's in that moment of utter travesty that 8 nations from across the global south, South Africa, Colombia, Namibia, Senegal, Malaysia, Honduras, Cuba, Colombia, and Bolivia come together to say, we will enforce our international law obligations. And actually what they say is not radical at all. They say something very simple. We'll uphold our obligations under ICC. Should any of these war criminals come to set foot on our soil, we will arrest them. We will not export arms to be used against the Palestinian people from our factories, and we will not let our ports be used to transfer arms or ammunition or military fuel, again, to sell it to Israel to be used against Palestinians. Not radical, not novel, but I think the message at the core of it is quite powerful, which is to say we will not allow our land and our labor to be used to violate international law and murder Palestinians in this genocide. That Hague Group has now grown from that initial group of 8 countries to nearly 15 countries adopting measures far wider than the ones that we began with, also reviewing public contracts to ensure that taxpayer money, again, is not used to entrench Israel's illegal occupation in the Palestinian territories, and to support universal jurisdiction that applies not just to Netanyahu and Gallant under the ICC arrest warrants, but really criminals across the Israeli military who we know, documented, live-streamed on television, have been committing war crimes. As of last month, we had 40 states meet on the question of accountability, the largest European delegation, asking something very simple. Can we ensure that we hold criminals accountable on our own land, in our own jurisdictions, even as we know that the United Nations Security Council or the General Assembly are being held hostage by a few powerful countries at our own ports of entry? We shall demand that Israeli travelers disclose their ID of service, so we do not allow war criminals, for example, to enter our country or hold them accountable in each of our own courts. So we see the coalition expanding, but at the core of it, I would maintain it's really still not novel, because we are following international law, looking at our obligations under the ICJ and asking within our own national jurisdictions, how can we start enforcing it?
How far is this a sort of rearguard action? I mean, you're up against, in this case, look, the US has always had a kind of fraught relationship with international law in various different ways, Israel even more so. But what we've seen since the genocide started and Israel's attack in Gaza is like open contempt really for the processes of international law. But over and above whatever Israel has done in the past, I feel that this is even more we don't care. And I think, directly quoting Benjamin Netanyahu on this point, we will do what we want. Even The Hague can't stop us. You're in The Hague for the ICJ judgment, or at least the finding that there was a plausible case for genocide, that Israel was committing genocide against Palestine. But the response of the US was to say, okay, we'll defund the agencies that brought this case, and we'll look at ways to put legal sanctions on South Africa. On one level, it's good to see that form of solidarity that the Hague Group brings together and starts to enact. But on the other hand, this is quite a desperate sort of circumstances where international law itself is being treated with such contempt.
Absolutely. Again, I don't want to sound like international law was once a beautiful thing and it's only in this moment that it's being destroyed. The ICC, famously, in internal circles, used to be called the black man's court because it was only the leaders from, again, the black part of the world they used to be held to account. And we saw what happened when the first time we've tried to hold Netanyahu to account, and it's been entirely sanctioned. And in fact, they're cannibalizing their own officials and their own institutions. European governments have not stood up. Their own judges are on the panel of the ICC judges right now, who cannot access their bank accounts, who cannot pay school fees for their own children in the Netherlands. And the European Council and the European Commission, despite having clauses that would allow them to break through these sanctions, have not passed it. They'd rather be, again, as we've seen on multiple other fronts, vassals to the United States on this question rather than defend international law. But, James, you talked about being in the court. I had a funny experience, quite contrary to the somber mood at the time, which is going into the Great Hall of the Peace Palace in The Hague. It's not great at all. It's actually quite tiny. But if you look around, you have these beautiful stained glass panels all around, which was supposed to be this, donation from Andrew Carnegie, the philanthropist, but really, again, some of them made money off of the slave trade in the United States, were given it as a $1.5 million donation, right? And it depicted the mission of the court, which was about the evolution of the peace ideal, or more specifically, the spreading of the, I think it's the legal conscience of the civilized world to the rest of the planet that up until that point, again, for them, is stuck in primitivity. I certainly looked up and thought, I, as an Indian, don't see myself in the stained glass windows. I was looking at my South African colleagues, Irish lawyers, and thinking, I'm not sure they see themselves in this legal conscience of the civilized world either. So really no illusions about what it is that we are trying to play with, the tools that we're playing with. But I think the fact that it was a South African delegation that brought this historic case to the court itself is an encounter that changes the very texture of the institutions that we are defending on the one hand, but completely clear-eyed about their needing to be, reform is an unfortunate word, but needing to really change their character in dramatic ways.
Just on that, I mean, why is Europe so pathetic? And is it ever going to get any better? I mean, it's really striking that, exactly as you say, that there are European judges who are now being subject to various forms of sanctions and the rest of it. And the response is basically, some occasionally harsh words, but that's about it. Some variation around different European states. But on the whole, this is just nothing whatsoever. So why so pathetic on this question? And will it ever get better?
You should tell me, but I think you guys need to elect some better leaders, certainly. But, I think the same dynamics that we've actually seen with the Global South of political economic dependency have come home to roost kind of in Europe in the last decade. We certainly saw that with the sanctions against Russia, a completely self-defeating move for Europe, and not for the US, which is way more self-sufficient than European nations. And we're seeing that right now, where Europe at this point is being kind of held hostage by the United States to renew natural gas deal contract, right? Making it forever subservient again to the United States. Just as I've made the prescription that we should diversify as the countries of the Global South and that we should decouple, Europe is binding itself even more into just this lone relationship of complete submission to the United States economy.
But then how do you break it? What do you do? If you're sitting in Europe, what do you do?
I think realize that your ally is not this one big behemoth bully across the ocean. I mean, let's back up a bit historically. The idea that Europe, which is West Asia, technically, with Africa close by about 200 meters away, and the Middle East, as we call it, or really the countries of the Gulf right next door, and Asia, travelable by foot, are not its natural allies, but that it's a separate continent, which is, again, such a huge fiction, whose natural ally is the United States, like thousands of kilometers away, is insane to me. And I think that's the fiction that's needed to be broken, where every bloc that you see, the transcontinental alliance is the only one that comes forth. European countries have not formed a coalition with countries of the Global South in the last half century. This is across the board, and we see that in the Hague Group as well, where they weren't founding members. Of course, they're willing to engage, but you haven't seen them work in tandem with countries of the Global South. And that's really, the only thing that Europe can do right now if it doesn't want to find itself completely defanged without any tools left at its disposal.
Just picking up on that fiction, and also a word you mentioned and sort of hesitated on, which is reform of the international legal system. And to what extent is the Hague Group in that case a project to reform international law and how it operates, or is it actually proposing something quite different, a potentially very different system?
I think the project of the Hague Group is really to bring back a spirit of what we might call the Bandung spirit. Bandung, which was the historic conference of the oppressed peoples of the world, really, of Africa and Asia, that met in Indonesia to ask how could we collectively work together to achieve liberation, to essentially achieve sovereignty in some space to act. I think I'm sure if I were to look back at the Hague Group 5 years down the line, a decade down the line, I think bringing back that spirit of the new international economic order, of the non-aligned movement, where really you had the third world saying, we will not take our diktats from Europe, we will not take our diktats from, again, in this case, the rules-based international order, which is proven to be so hypocritical, but we will bring a different kind of fiery, defiant conscience into our legal institutions, is what the Hague Group brings. So I wouldn't say that the Hague Group is an extension of trying to defend that legal conscience of the civilized world, of the stained glass windows that we talked about in the ICJ, but really a defined conscience of the oppressed peoples of the world that is saying we will not use our land and labor any longer for the whims and fancies of the United States, of Washington or London or Paris.
So it's something that we've picked up on in Macrodose in the last few years. And I think it's getting more attention, broadly speaking, is the way in which that climate change alters the options that you have for agency, for the way that states act, for the way that people act. That because there are more extreme weather events around the world, because human society is increasingly disrupted by the impacts of climate change, whether it's floods or forest fires or droughts or whatever it might be, that the world being reshaped around us is also shifting the options that people have to act. So the example that leaps out, I suppose, wasn't really the intention, but the Houthi blockade of the Red Sea was made more powerful in its impact on world trade and the prices of goods that we see in the shops, because at the same time the Panama Canal was in the middle of a drought, which meant it couldn't be used to full capacity. So the question, I suppose, is, in addition to this general collapse of human institutions and the disorder that you see there, there is also this broader collapse of the stable environment that we've all lived in as human beings for the last 100,000 or so years that we've been around as modern humanity. And I'm just wondering, to bring that down a bit, is that how far does that alter the potential for resistance and different forms of resistance in a world that is being shaken up both by the loss of these sort of stable liberal institutions, but also the bigger, more profound loss of a stable environment for us all to live in?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And this moment is, for me, quite dangerous and really quite tragic because it's a double whammy. If you look at the US-Israeli reckless war on Iran and what it's done to the environment right now, we see reports about something close to 5 million tons of carbon already having been emitted into the environment in just the first 12 days of this war. And the fact that what you essentially have is the US bombing Iran while it's at the negotiating table, having made unprecedented concessions, right? Promising to degrade its nuclear stockpile, conditions it had never accepted before, essentially means that you have two nuclear states bombing a non-nuclear state, which is asking itself the question, yeah, okay, I guess the only security deterrent then is having a nuke, right? And if I'm a middle power watching the situation, I'm asking myself the exact same question. So it's a more paradigmatic shift towards a security state logic that has infected all conversations. And this is across the South and the North and across the political spectrum. We saw President Lula talk about, upping defense budget for Brazil, which has had historically very low defense spending. We see South Africa talking about the same thing, which again, historically, you'll remember, gave up its nukes, which the apartheid regime had developed in order to be in support of the non-proliferation. But I bring this up because it's a double whammy, as just as the environment is being destroyed even more, the money that we would have allocated towards climate change programs, towards more sustainable programs, towards ensuring that we're, reducing the impact of floods in our cities, ensuring we have more renewable power, is now further being redirected back again to one of the biggest polluters, which is our military across the world. And in the immediate impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, we also saw in my part of the world, in Asia, which is completely dependent on natural gas and fossil fuels, where there's very, very low levels of renewable energy, already within 3 days, we shifted to a shorter working week from Vietnam to Bangladesh to Sri Lanka to India. You have rationing protocols in place across South Asia and Southeast Asia. In my city, my mom sent me a video yesterday already of tens of kilometers of lines of auto rickshaws who don't have any gas and fuel to fill up. So you have these lines developing and schools now being closed, people being given work from home instructions. And because we are not self-sufficient, because we have been so dependent on the fossil fuel infrastructure that, again, this choke point has proved completely fatal, right? I do think there's a really huge impact in terms of our ability to resist, and for people in these economies to be able to resist when we're fundamentally dependent again on this kind of model of production that leaves us with in lines waiting for a cylinder for days to come.
This can all look quite bleak, right? It's difficult to sort of sit here and turn on the television or just pay any attention to what's happening in the world and think, well, everything's going just swimmingly. It's really quite profoundly not, and it's a deeply disturbed and disturbing world that we've entered over the last few years, and really as recently as that in many ways. But what are the points of hope in all of this? Like you've raised some forms of solidarity that have appeared. What are the bits where you could say that form of solidarity is a gateway to building something new and different? How do we get to something out of this mess and this wreckage and the bits that don't work and everything falling apart and the brutality? Out of all of this, what's the route to building something better?
Yeah, I think I am quite disturbed by one broader shift that infects all of us, and this is both the global north and the south, which is, I think, shifting to a security state logic, where we've talked a lot about sovereignty in today's episode, but I think what we're seeing is economic sovereignty doesn't mean all that much, no matter what you do, if you don't have a big army, if you don't have a nuke, essentially, right? And I think that logic's really infecting our own projects. We're seeing this in Brazil, for example. President Lula is now talking about upping defense. The leader who historically was always about schools and healthcare and social policy is now saying, let's have a defense pact with South Africa. We're seeing the Sahel states, who again came to not power, some of them through coups, who talked about independence, now talking entirely about a defense pact. So this shift away from, what you and I would everyday people want, which is better schools for their children and better hospitals for our families. That money being moved into armies, even in socialist projects, even in governments of the global south. That's a shift that really terrifies me as we explore the concept of sovereignty across the board. But we see ordinary people breaking that. The flotilla that went to Cuba this month with medicines, with food, with clothes, delivering humanitarian aid is a source of great inspiration. The trade unionists that have blocked ports saying we will not use our labor to transport arms, and the dock workers that have gone on strike from Kerala to Greece to, in fact, the United Kingdom are, I think, showing us what material solidarity looks like. And that really gives you a picture of what internationalism could look like, what our societies should look like, where we're not just bogged down by internal hatred and looking really at the figure of the migrant as, again, the enemy, but rather the interconnectedness of each of our societies and what it would take to build happier lives for each of us.
Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, James.